Joining me now on the phone is Neal Katyal, constitutional lawyer and former acting solicitor general under President Obama. Neal, I want to get to you straight away on this. What do you make of this fight between the President of the United States and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court?
Well, it's really quite extraordinary. I'm not aware of anything really like it in our lifetime. The Chief Justice, I've appeared before him 37 times and to argue cases. And I think it's fair to say, the adjectives you think about when you think about the Chief Justice are restrained, brilliant, dignified. That's everything that Donald Trump isn't. And I think this whole episode demonstrates that. Trump is saying some pretty extraordinary things about the courts, things that he's actually just statistically wrong on, like that it's the most overturned court in the last 5 years. It's not even close to the most overturned court. But it's more than that. It's a corrosive attitude about courts and the rule of law.
This attitude about courts and the rule of law, what's the consequence?
I mean, it's huge. I don't think that Trump he cares much about the Ninth Circuit per se. I think there's a bigger programmatic agenda of which this is part, which is to delegitimize the court system, to attack the courts, and to attack the Chief Justice. And I think it's very similar to how he treats any other check and balance, any other institution against him, whether it's the media, which you obviously, Katie, know well, and all the stuff about CNN and Acosta, or the Justice Department and FBI, from firing his attorney general, firing Comey, the FBI director. Basically his MO is to attack any institution, any check and balance that stands in his way. And that's why I think, the words you said at the outset of the program are right. I mean, these are the actions of authoritarian governments. They're certainly not the actions of any president of the United States in our lifetime.
Would this mean anything for a fight, potentially, an actual fight in the Supreme Court between Donald Trump and Robert Mueller's team for subpoena power for the president, and that goes to the Supreme Court? Would this affect a ruling?
Well, I think the 9 justices are, wise enough to do the thing that they're going to do and make the decisions they're going to make. So I don't think, this episode, you can say, oh, it's going to mean Mueller will win or Trump will lose or anything like that. But I think it does demonstrate, the president's insouciance to the rule of law. It may not affect the cases that go to the Supreme Court, but remember the Chief Justice has one other really important role in our Constitution, which is to preside over the impeachment proceedings of a president. And, the way things are looking, that very well may happen. And the Chief Justice may be, in presiding over this man that he's now in this Twitter fight with.
Let me ask you this. If he loses a subpoena battle at the Supreme Court, and that's obviously an if because there's not even a subpoena battle at the Supreme Court yet, but if he does lose one, will he now try to say that Justice Roberts was not a fan of Donald Trump's? And will he use this political attack that he's launching on the judiciary as a way to inoculate himself in the future by saying, well, I attacked them, so they must hate me, which means that's why they ruled against me?
Exactly, 100%. That is President Trump's goal here, which is to delegitimize the institution of the court. So any ruling that's against him, he can just chalk up to, oh, they were biased against me. And, that's what the Chief Justice today was so rebelling against, this idea that there's a Trump judge or an Obama judge or anything like that. No, there are just judges in this country. And, to me, when I think of the judiciary, I think of people like Justice Kagan, who were put on the court, and within the first year, she was put on by President Obama, but she voted against President Obama's health care plan in a good part and voted to strike some of it down. That's the kind of independence that our founders envisioned when it comes to the Supreme Court, not this kind of, president's lackey thing, which the president has tried to do now with the Attorney General, and I'm sure he's going to try to do it with the courts, too.
And our good friend Chuck Rosenberg was here a moment ago pointing out that with Nixon and with Clinton, judges that were appointed by both men ruled against them in subpoena fights when there were investigations into those two presidents. So in that way, those judges were not protectors of the President of the United States. My other question is slightly different. Are we as a society more to blame for this than we're willing to let on, given the way that we talk about judges, given the way that we talk about Supreme Court nominees and then justices? This is an Obama justice. This is a Trump justice. We talk a lot about it with Kavanaugh. We've talked about it with Gorsuch. We've assumed that they would rule a certain way because of being appointed or nominated by Donald Trump. Does some of the blame here for this being such a fertile ground for Donald Trump lie with us?
Well, I think that's a wise point you're making, Katie, and we all share something about that. I agree with that. But at the same time, you know, it's the president's job to rise above that and to call for our better angels and to talk about really what the courts have always been about, both from our founding design on, and not to give in to those impulses. And that's why you haven't had anything like the remarks you've had by this president. Every time he loses a case, it's, oh, that's a so-called judge, or that judge is biased because they're Hispanic, or things like that. This is deeply, deeply corrosive, and it takes a lot, I'm sure, to get the Chief Justice upset and to have him make any sort of remarks. But, you know, Donald Trump managed to do that, and that, to me, is an incredibly telling thing.
A president should be better than us all. Neal Katyal. Neal, I know you're on a plane right now going home for Thanksgiving, so thank you so much for calling in. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie. Happy Thanksgiving to you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.